You're seeing a real shift right now in the parties, and I think if you talk to any American, and myself included, one of the biggest surprises, we talked about this earlier, is we're starting to not, frankly, recognize the parties as we grew up and knew them. You know, as you know, we have a very, I mean, it's basically a two-party system, and unfortunately for, and I have dear friends who have registered as independents, I mean, they haven't always really had a voice. You know, we call them the swing vote, because they usually have to pick, you know, one side or the other. It's two parties, Republican, Democrats. Over the years, the Republicans have really, you know, focused their stances on what they would call limited government. They would say it's a platform focus on, you know, fiscal responsibility. That's a tagline you hear again. And not speaking from the Democratic Party, oftentimes they would say that that's more of a focus on social services. You know, looking more at funding inwardly, you know, in the United States on things like, you know, education, healthcare, maybe with more of a bent. Republicans would say Democrats are for bigger government, and Democrats would say, no, we're for more services. But this is starting to shift. You're starting to really see the graying of the lines. You also saw more years ago, and I would say this today too, what defined the parties for some people was more what the parties were for or versus against. And you do find one thing up until the last couple of years where the parties were very much unified in thought. So for instance, for many years, one of the big dividing issues was a social issue, which is the abortion issue. Which, you know, so there were starting to be sort of certain topics that really defined the parties, but you were definitely starting to see a graying of areas.
Take on the next thing. So we are a country with corruption, and in US there is something called speed money, so which we keep hearing. So how do you differentiate between a corruption and a speed money? So we are most of the time we're a little confused with the idea of speed money and corruption, and we as a country, as an entire political system has taken to a new level with that word corruption. So how do you differentiate between corruption and speed money, and in a US, the American context?
Maybe my other colleagues from the States are more familiar with that term than I am. I actually don't know the term speed money, so I'm just thinking maybe we're referencing it. Is it me? Okay. All right. I'm not entirely sure about the term. One thing I think which is coming up, and I'm wondering if this is sort of what the correlation is between the massive amounts of money that are spent on our elections. I know this is something that is covered a lot in the media, especially right now. And there's been a lot of concern at looking at, you know, are there loopholes for, let's say, corporations to fund candidates? Lobbying has also, and that may be also a term, there was a big, I would say actually even public as well as sort of legal backlash against sort of what we would call lobbying practices. Probably in the last 10 years as well, where suddenly not only government officials, but you know, it was mainly the citizen populace saying, wait a minute, you know, what sort of access and normally it was touted, and I don't think that's always fair, as corporate, you know, what sort of corporate influence do, you know, corporations have on politicians, et cetera, and a lot of it came down to money, is looking at who's financing which campaigns. We'll say there has been a great bipartisan effort to champion and pass campaign finance legislation, but this is continuing to be something, if you're listening to the elections now, which candidates keep throwing against other candidates. You will even hear this in the Sanders campaign, where he's from the same party as Hillary Clinton, but he's constantly throwing at her that she's in, you know, cahoots with Wall Street, you know, and he'll say the big money in the big banks. And so now increasingly there's been all this sort of public outrage, like, you know, is she, you know, in the pockets of Wall Street, and what does that